Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of Talmud for the Curious. We have a lot to cover again, not that we haven't covered an awful lot, but rather than spending a lot of time on introduction, I have 2 subjects that I'm going to be speaking about. The first one has to do with the printing of the Talmud and how did we end up with a Talmud that was dedicated to a pope. Since its creation, Talmuds were made by hand. And of course, 2,711 double-sided pages was a lot to do by hand. In 1450, Gutenberg invents the printing press with movable type. And we all have heard about the Gutenberg Bibles. So the first thing that he went to print was the Bible. The illustrations were still done by hand, so it was expensive. And the other reason he started with the Bible is that back then, very few people outside of the nobility could read. Gutenberg was a good printer, but he wasn't a very good businessman. He didn't really figure out how to get his books distributed. Most of them were never sold. He died penniless. But who else in Europe were literate besides the nobility? The Jews, of course. So Jews quickly saw an opportunity to spread Jewish knowledge. In 1483, Joshua Sansino, a name you need to remember, established a small printing business outside of Milan, and using the printing press, started to print the first tractate of Talmud. While his volume lacked what we call pagination, which are the numbers, which are so critical, so we all know we're on the same page, it contained Rashi's commentary on the inner column on the right, and Tosafot on the outer column, just as Sheldon has beautifully explained to you. And that format has been maintained ever since. And Sansino ultimately printed 16 tractates. So this is what Talmud looked like before Sansino, and this is what it looks like today. This is what Sheldon has been showing you. And this comes from Sansino. Big-time Jewish printing got its start from Daniel Bomberg, who was a Christian. He moved to Venice in 1515. Venice at that time was a city-state. It was really the leading place in Europe. There was a large Jewish community, and Bomberg decided to become a specialist in Hebrew printing. And his goal was to print the most accurate Talmud using the finest paper and printing material. And somewhere around 1520, the first mass-produced complete set of Babylonian Talmud with pagination, that's the numbering sequence, with the page layout that we see today. He freely adopted Sansino's layout of the text with the commentaries. However, being Jewish wasn't so easy. Printing and being Jewish wasn't any better. So printing Jewish was not so easy. First, he had to get permission. They weren't so happy about printing Jewish books, but with a little well-paced bribes of about 500 pieces of 8, he got it. Then he had to bribe the city fathers to allow 4 well-instructed Jewish men to leave the ghetto and travel outside without having to wear their distinctive Jewish yellow caps to research it and to make sure that what they were printing was accurate. Bomberg's Talmuds were all typeset from manuscripts. They had to be checked by the learned Jewish men for spelling, grammar, cross-referencing. It took about 4 years to print it. And the Jews were very excited because this news and the availability of Jewish texts spread throughout Europe. It's good for the Jews, and by the way, the last sale of a Bomberg Babylonian Talmud was at Sotheby's in 2015 for $9.3 million. So if you've got one in your basement, it's worth quite a bit. So the Jews were very happy, but we know that if in the Middle Ages, if you make the Jews happy, we're going to end up making the Christians not so happy. Jewish printing quickly spread to the Iberian Peninsula. Unfortunately, as we talked about in 1492, they kicked the Jews out. So the Jewish refugees spread out, but they took with them the printing business. And it's interesting that they started printing Talmuds in Constantinople 200 years before the Turks got around to printing their own books, actually using printing. In 1583, the brothers Joseph and Solomon Jabez began printing the Talmud in Constantinople. Other sites that were very popular for printing was in Morocco and Fez, and in Salonika in Turkey or Greece. As I said earlier, the Catholics weren't very happy that lots of Jewish books were starting to, so there was a pushback to ban Jewish literature and burn Jewish books. There were so-called Battle of the Books happened in the early 1500s. There were some Christian humanists, one in particular, Johann Witlin, who thought that there was a real value to Jewish books and wanted to see them maintained. And of course, as I mentioned before, you have the apostate Jews, in this case, Johannes Pfefferkorn, who got into trouble. He got convicted of burglary, and they said, well, we'll kind of let you off if you tell us all the Jewish secrets. So he wrote a series of pamphlets on behalf of the Dominicans, claiming to reveal the secret world of Jewish thought, condemning Jews and Jewish faith. And he pushed for the expulsion of all Jews from Germany, and that every copy of the Talmud and rabbinic texts that could be located should be confiscated and destroyed. So there raged in Christian Europe this intense battle. Did the Jewish books have some value, or should they be condemned and banned? Initially, the opponents of Jewish books succeeded in getting the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I to ban the Talmud and to destroy any Jewish books that could be located. This was going to be an epic tragedy in the making, until Witlin found somebody who could top the Holy Roman Empire. And that's not easy to do, but he found a pope, Pope Leo X. He actually was of the wealthy Medici family. We've all seen their stuff on TV. He was a Renaissance cultured man, patron of the arts, and he actually had a legitimate tolerance for the Jews. So in 1518, he took a public stand on the Battle of the Books. Not only should the Talmud not be banned, he gave Bamberg permission to use the new printing presses to publish his complete set of the Talmud, which was why Bamberg dedicated the early editions to Pope Leo X. He also eased up many of the other restrictions on the Jews in the Papal States, in Venice. Unfortunately for the Jews, he died unexpectedly at the age of 46, and the next pope was not so kind to the Jews. As I mentioned in my last talk, now we've got the Protestant Reformation, so the Pope goes into protective mode. So they go ahead and they ban 500 authors, including Jewish books and the Talmud. And unfortunately, they also resumed the seizure and burning of Jewish books. They had a whole bonfire in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome on Rosh Hashanah in 1553. And basically, for the next 30 or 40 years, there were no Jewish books being printed in Italy at all. Eventually, popes changed. They were petitioned by the Jews. They allowed printing to resume with one big caveat. Any offensive references to Christianity had to be removed. So Christian censors edited the text, and they only allowed them to print the parts that they felt were not offensive. Eventually, the Jews decided it was better if they sort of got involved themselves, and so we sort of censored books for hundreds of years. And this is what a page of a censored Jewish book would look like, where they just basically took essentially ink and magic markers and just blotted out arbitrarily whatever sections that particular censor, for whatever particular reason, decided to ban. However, Jews have a little seichel. So in order to run a printing press, you had to have a license, but Jews couldn't have a license. So what the Jews figured how to do was to get a non-Jew to own the license for the press, but the Jews owned the business. So everybody got happy. They had non-Jews doing the printing, but we figured out how to make it work. We figured out how to make a little bit of living from it. So we're smart enough to know how to get around some of these things. As we go a little further on, the most definitive recent edition is the Vilna Talmud, or the Vilna Shas. It was published by the firm of Widow and the brothers Ram in Lithuania in 1886. And this is the most authoritative version that is now used sort of around the world. It has a traditional edition with its commentaries. And this is what the page looks like. And the only difference that you'll see is they've added on the margins. You can see there are a lot more little commentaries by more contemporary Talmudists. This is the more traditional version, again, that Sheldon has and the Rabbi have gone over, and they've added more around the outsides in the Vilna one. And of course, as we get close to today, we don't have to use the printing press. We have digital Talmud. Multiple websites where you can go online. Sefaria is one that I think is particularly good. It was founded in 2013. It's open source. It has the Talmud in Hebrew and in English. The whole Talmud is available and it's free. So if anybody is curious, if anybody wants to read, you go to their website, you don't have to pay any money, and you have the entire Talmud. So we've come a long way from handwritten, laborious things to the age we live in. You can just go online and you can pick out what you want, and we can all study Talmud. So kind of an interesting story. We're going to change gears a little bit for the next 15 minutes of my talk, from the printing of Talmud to the similarities that I came across as I've done some of my research between the legal codes in Judaism and the legal codes in Islam. There are, and the first disclaimer, I am not saying that they are the same religion or that they think of all the topics in the same way. But it is interesting to me, considering the state of affairs in the world today, how similar Islam and Judaism are in the way they have set up their legal structures. And I'm going to show you the parallels. For instance, both Judaism and Islam deny that Jesus was the Son of God. We like to think that maybe we're closer to Christianity, but we're not. The Quran says, and I will quote, "O people of the book, Christians, commit no excesses in your religion, nor say of Allah anything but the truth. Jesus Christ, the Son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah and his word, which he bestowed on Mary, a spirit proceeding from him." So the unity of God is something that's a very crucial tenet of both these religions. Muslims repeat it 5 times a day. Jews say it at least twice a day. The 5 pillars of Islam, the essential core, can be traced to many Talmudic and Old Testament scores. Muhammad, in the way like Moses, is a divinely inspired prophet. He is not a deity. So again, there is no Trinity. There is the unity of God. Both Judaism and Islam consider the study of religious law to be a form of worship and a worthy end in itself. And they both have images of God and studying with God in heaven. The Islamic law and Talmudic law are theocratic in nature. By that I mean they are divinely revealed law combined with human reason. When we think about history and context, and that's something that Sheldon and I have always been about, the Muslim law code originated in the Baghdad region. So the site of the first important Islamic law center was at Kufa, which was not very far from the Babylonian Jewish legal centers in Sura and Pumbedita. So they were fairly close geographically. All these scholars could speak to each other because they all spoke Aramaic. And each faith ended up dealing and influencing the other in terms of certain similar issues. As an example, the structure of Islamic law has direct parallels to Jewish law. The Quran is a divine revelation. It is the first root of Islamic law in a similar way that the Torah is the first root of Jewish law and was given by God to Moses. We have an oral tradition, the Mishna. They have an oral tradition, the Sunnah. The discussion of the Mishnah, the Gemara, is paralleled by something called an Ima. And if I pronounce it wrong, please excuse me. And the same way we have Talmudic reasoning, they have Muslim reasoning that is also by analogy called the Qiyah. So the structure is the same. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the Sunnah because it parallels what we're talking about. It is a body of oral tradition that has been handed down supposedly from the Prophet Muhammad or his contemporaries in an unbroken chain of transmission, as we feel about the Mishnah. And the Sunnah is based on thousands of what are called hadith. These are anecdotes and stories of the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, which resemble in style Jewish Midrashic and Aggadic literature. So the Sunnah parallels the Mishnah. One reads the Quran, but teaches the Sunnah. One reads the Torah, but is taught the Mishnah. And it is learned by oral tradition, by constant repetition. So the Sunnah serves a similar function to what the stories and rulings in Mishnah deals with. And it deals with lots of things: ritual purity, prayer, marriage, divorce, in the same way that the Mishnah covers all these subjects. So both Islam and Judaism are God-given written documents. The Jewish system of law we call halakha. The Islamic system they called Sharia. They both mean a pathway or a way to go. So as I said, there's been a certain amount of cross-pollination, but at the beginning, there was a lot more that the Muslims sort of adapted from Judaism. So for instance, when we talk about the sanctity of uniqueness of a human life, the Quran says, and I'm going to read it, "We decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, it is if he had slain mankind entirely. And whoever saves one, it is as if he had saved mankind entirely." The Rabbi has quoted from the Mishnah. And what we said, the way we phrased it, was Adam was created alone to teach you that whoever takes a human life is considered by the Bible to have destroyed an entire world. And whoever saves a human life is considered by the Bible as if he had preserved an entire world. You can see how closely the teachings parallel each other. This was a Hebrew Bible that this is what it looks like in Arabic. And Jewish scholars in Baghdad, in Babylonia, such as Sadia ben Yosef, translated the Torah into Arabic so that our holy book could be shared and discussed with Islamic scholars. You see, when I was looking, you'll find from big things to little things. One of the talks that the rabbi discussed was, when do you say the Shema? How do you decide when it's evening? When is it time to pray? Well, there's also a ritual definition of when is daybreak. The Quran says you begin your fast in the morning, because it's at daybreak, when the white thread of dawn becomes distinct to you from a black thread. Similarly, the Jewish Mishna says morning prayer is when the worshiper can distinguish between a blue and a white, black and white, blue and white. We look at the world in a very similar way. I'm not going to go through all of this, but if you look at Jewish kosher laws, and if you look at halal, which is Islamic law, and you start looking about how it should be considered and what can be consumed, they are very similar. They are not identical, but it is quite similar. Muslim influences on Talmudic law happened as the Jews now lived under Muslim rule, especially in terms of matters of finance and commerce. As again has been alluded to, Rabbi Shmuel said, when it came to civil law, the law of the land is the law. So the Jews were supposed to conform to the laws of the land in which they were living. So as Arab and Baghdadi law changed, Jewish law changed in terms of commercial contracts, money transfers, items that were initially prohibited by the Talmud were reevaluated, and Jewish law changed to conform with Arabic law, which was the civil law that the Jews were living under. And I have to very briefly mention what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula. Sephardic Jewry, I'm sure somebody here is of Sephardic ancestry. And that was a great period of prosperity for the Jews. Compared to what was going on in medieval Christian Europe, Jews, although they were second-class citizens, by the dhimmi laws, they had to pay certain taxes. They were given a great deal of freedom, and Jewish art and philosophy and literature flourished in the Iberian Peninsula. Moses Maimonides, for instance, one of the foremost Jewish intellectuals of the Middle Ages. That's where he lived. He wrote many works, often written in Arabic. He wrote a commentary on the Mishna when he was 23 years old. His most famous work, which was Mishna Torah, is written in Hebrew, and it is an analysis of Jewish law that is still highly valued today. He also was a physician, and he wrote several treatises. So I thought it was important, considering the current state of the affairs and sort of what goes on in politics today, to reflect back on a lot of the similarities there are in some of the philosophies between the two religions, between Judaism and Islam, which I believe in a lot of ways is closer than between Judaism and Christianity. So to kind of figure and stop my part on an up note, I have a short video that I would like to show you of cooperation between Muslims and Jews.
हम लोग जो केयरटेकर काम करते हैं कोलकाता के ये सेनाकोक में, मैगन डेविड सेनाकोक में, मेरा यहाँ पर फादर भी 50-60 साल काम करके गए। अभी मुझे भी यहाँ पर 2008 से मैं काम कर रहा हूँ। देखिए, मेरा नाम रब्बुल खान है, मैं मुस्लिम हूँ।
Our grandparents always preferred to have Muslims over here, because they also worship God or the Almighty, which we do also.
They don't eat ham, pork, or bacon, so we know that those meats will never be brought into the synagogue. And we were Middle Eastern Jews. I call us Arab Jews. My family lived in the Ottoman and Turkish Empire for thousands of years, and even before that in the Middle East. So we were very familiar with Islam.
It's a generation after generation that has been of these people who look up to the synagogue. As a young boy, I used to play marbles with them. My relationship with them was, excellent. We play together, go to movies together, and what boys used to do.
बात है कि जब हम छोटे थे ना, उन लोगों के साथ मतलब कि ऐसे मिस जाते थे हम लोग। बच्चे के अंदर बहुत मोहब्बत आता था। जब सुनते हैं कि यहाँ पर जूस कम्युनिटी के नमाज में मुस्लिम केयरटेकर हैं, तो वो अचानक चौंक जाते हैं ना। हमको इस इलाक़ों के प्रति बहुत अच्छा लगता है, काहे कि जैसे कि हम लोग यहाँ पर पैदाइश हुआ कोलकाता के अंदर से यहाँ पर परवरिश हुआ, इन्हीं के पास हम लोग का मोहब्बत हुआ।
These synagogues, I always remember, it always looked like this before also, right? The same color, the same furniture, only the people are missing, the Jewish people are missing.
पीरियड टाइम में सब जेंट्स लोग नीचे में रहता रहा, पूरा ये भर जाता रहा, और ऊपर में पीरियड टाइम में लेडीज़ लोग ऊपर में प्रेयर कर रहे थे। तो उस टाइम में हम लोग को बहुत खुशी लगता था। अभी मतलब ये लोग जब बाहर जाने लगे, तो यहाँ पर जब ये लोग का मतलब तादाद कम गया, तो हमको तो थोड़ा तो दुख तो लगबे करेगा।
Many global events and national events were the cause of Jews moving away. There was partition riots between Hindus and Muslims, and Calcutta was a flashpoint. By the 1960s, from a community of 4,000, it dwindled to about 600 or 700. And people like my grandmother felt she could no longer live a Jewish life in Calcutta. And so the last set of people also started leaving.
It's a micro community now, hardly 20, 21 Jewish people, right? Most of them are over the age of 70. We don't have a young community ready to take over. But as long as they are here, they keep on taking.
Anyhow, I thought that was interesting. And hopefully one day, as the slide says, we will be able to dwell in peace with our Arab neighbors. So anyhow, thank you. And I'm going to turn the program at this point over to Sheldon.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. During the last 3 weeks, I discussed the development and the architecture of Talmud. But we are now swimming in the sea of Talmud. Today, I will discuss the importance of Talmud throughout the ages and the importance of study and learning for the Jewish people. We begin with a 3-minute video by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died in 2020. Rabbi Sachs was Chief Rabbi of England, and this video is titled, "The Way of Study, Listening to God." Jenny?
Jews are the people of the book. Talmud Torah, studying Torah, is the greatest of all the commands and the secret of Jewish continuity. In the Shema, we are commanded, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your might. Then, almost immediately, it says, teach these things repeatedly to your children, speaking of them when you sit at home and when you travel on the way, when you lie down and when you rise. Judaism is a religion of education. Study is holier even than prayer. For in prayer we speak to God, but in study we listen to God. We strive to understand what God wants from us. We try to make His will ours. For the holiest thing is God's word. The Torah, God's word to our ancestors, is our constitution as a nation, our covenant of liberty, the code by which we decipher the mystery and meaning of life. The words of the Torah span 1,000 years, from Moses to Malachi, the first and last of the prophets. For another 1,000 years, until the completion of the Babylonian Talmud, Jews added commentaries to the book. And for yet another 1,000 years, they wrote commentaries to the commentaries. Never has there been a deeper relationship between a people and a book. The ancient Greeks, puzzled by the phenomenon of an entire people dedicated to learning, called Jews a nation of philosophers. Certainly, we're called on to be a nation of students and teachers. In Judaism, we not only learn to live, we live to learn. In study, we make Torah real in the mind so that we can make it actual in the world.
Thank you, Jenny. Two important takeaways from this video are: first, in Judaism, we not only learn to live, but we live to learn. And secondly, when I pray, I speak to God, but when I study, God speaks to me. Every culture has its elite, its aristocracy, people who represent the ideal that others strive to emulate. There are aristocracies like kings and queens, or powerful and wealthy people at the pinnacle of society. Judaism also has an aristocracy, not in wealth or power, but in knowledge. In Jewish culture, it is the scholars who are the aristocracy and enjoy preeminent status in Judaism. A wealthy Jew would be proud to have a poor scholar marry his daughter, just so he can support the scholar as he fulfills the commandment to study. Let's watch a short clip of the movie Yentl. Barbra Streisand is forbidden to study Talmud because she's a girl, so she impersonates a male yeshiva student. In this short clip, she and another student are having dinner at the home of a wealthy Jew whose daughter, Amy Irving, is engaged to marry the other yeshiva student.
So congratulations, Anshel, accepted in a fine yeshiva. Your father would be proud.
I hope so.
Sure. I understand he was a scholar too.
Yes, he was.
Now his son after him. May your father rest in peace.
May he rest in peace.
Avigdor's brother too. He told you.
Yes, he did.
Consumption. Terrible thing. Esther! At our table, 2 scholars waiting.
I'm coming.
Going to have a toast to the new yeshiva boy. L'chaim.
Not one scholar, 2 scholars. What an honor. How lucky can a man be? For thousands of years, Judaism has been a meritocracy based on scholarship and good deeds. Jewish society was ruled by learned men, and the leaders of each community were its best scholars. Their only qualification was scholastic ability, not social status or family wealth. Rabbi Akiva was one of our greatest Jewish scholars. He was poor and worked as a woodcutter, but still rose to greatness. The uniqueness of Rashi's family, with 3 generations of great scholars, shows how rare it was to have a Jewish intellectual dynasty. Jews created an educational system that was maintained for centuries. We can estimate the number of pupils at each educational level from this statement: 1,000 students to study Torah, 100 to study Mishna, 10 to study Gemara, and 1 to teach. Only 1 student out of every 1,000 reached the level of a scholar worthy to teach others. Jewish scholarship began with our ancient sages. Sages were charismatic teachers who were pious, interpreted the law, and had many disciples. Think of Hillel and Shammai. But even more than teachers, these people were looked upon as holy men, the physical embodiment of Torah. Everything a sage did or said could itself constitute Torah. Disciples studied closely every behavior of their sages to learn how to conduct themselves. There is a story of a disciple who concealed himself under the marital bed of his sage in order to learn how the sage behaved with his wife. When the disciple was asked why he did this, he said, "It is Torah, and it deserves to be studied." And the rabbis accepted that as valid. According to Jewish tradition, Moses received the oral Torah and handed it down to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the Great Assembly. And the Great Assembly handed it down to the Pharisees, and the Pharisees handed it down to the rabbis. Who were these Pharisees? The predecessors of rabbis. Next slide, please. At the beginning of the Common Era, while under Roman rule, Jews had 4 groups. The Sadducees did not believe in oral Torah. They were the temple priests and wealthy elites who welcomed Hellenization. When the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees' reason for existence, the temple, was gone. And so the Sadducees disappeared. The Essenes were ascetics. They went into the desert, wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and disappeared. The Zealots fought with Rome and died at Masada in 74 CE following the destruction of the temple. The Pharisees were traditional Jews. They accepted oral Torah and they opposed Hellenization and assimilation. It is from the Pharisees that the rabbis eventually emerged. Slide off, please. By the 1st century CE, the word rabbi had appeared, which means my teacher. The ancient Pharisees became the earliest rabbis, and Judaism became rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisees acquired a bad reputation, primarily because of Christian hostility to the Pharisees expressed in the New Testament. The Pharisees aimed to extend holiness from the temple in Jerusalem to everyday life. To the Pharisees, Torah was a source of infinite wisdom, and there was no better way to spend their lives than to study Torah. With the temple destroyed, the Pharisees and their rabbinic successors turned Judaism away from animal sacrifices in Jerusalem and towards the universal pursuit of holiness in our everyday life. While the temple existed, a Jew was only a spectator, watching the priests perform temple sacrifices. After the temple was destroyed, Judaism became a religion that required a person's active participation in Jewish communal prayer service. Since the 2nd century CE, most Jews lived as minorities within other communities and were governed by the laws of the land in which they lived, as Richard said. Jewish communities often functioned as self-regulating enclaves within a larger Gentile community. Jews had their own schools, burial societies, and religious courts. If a dispute involved only Jews, then the town's Jewish court could settle it according to Jewish law. Only the rabbis knew the whole Torah and Talmud, and only such knowledge qualified someone to lead the Jewish people. So it was the town rabbi who presided over Jewish institutions and the rabbinical court. Talmud became the first teaching document, the training manual for rabbis and rabbinic courts. The authority of rabbis comes from the Torah, which authorized the elders of each generation to create laws and render justice to the people of Israel. So for 2,000 years, the leaders of the Jewish community have been rabbis, and the Talmud was used by rabbis to lead the community. Hundreds of years before the Common Era, there were already synagogues inside and outside of Israel, wherever there was a Jewish community. Synagogues even existed in Jerusalem while the temple was still standing. Synagogues had existed for centuries, and the format of community prayer was well established. The synagogue became the rabbi's domain. It served as a place for public prayer, a community meeting place, and a school for children and adults to study Torah and Talmud. Talmud states that the world rests on three things: study, prayer, and good deeds. Of these three, the most important is study, because from study, one can learn prayer and good deeds. Talmud taught that Judaism is a life of constant study, and Jewish learning is never complete. Jews turn study into a holy endeavor. The more you study, the more you learn about God. That was the message in today's video by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Here is a short video with the lyrics of a song from Fiddler on the Roof. Let's see what Tevye, the poor dairyman, would do if he became wealthy. Jenny?
I know it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. You made many, many poor people. But would it have been so terrible if I had a small fortune? If I were a rich man, all day long I'd biddy biddy bum. If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a bitty bitty rich, idle man, I'd build a big tall house with rooms by the dozen, right in the middle of the town. A fine tin roof with real wooden floors below. There would be one long staircase just going up, and one even longer coming down, and one more leading nowhere just for show. If I were a rich man, all day long I'd biddy biddy bum. If I were a wealthy man, wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a bitty bitty rich, idle man. If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, and maybe have a seat by the eastern wall. And I'd discuss their holy books with the learned men 7 hours every day. That would be the sweetest thing of all. I know it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either.
Thank you, Jenny. So even as a rich man, Tevye's greatest joy would be to sit in synagogue and study holy books 7 hours a day. Talmud molded the Jewish people. It defined for Jews the way a good life should be conducted: orderly, logical, rational. No detail in everyday life is exempt from study or sanctification through study. Talmud study is sacred intellectualism, and learning is its own reward. The world may be based on Torah, but the intellectual pursuits of Judaism were found in Talmud. Talmud's worldview is best described by the word ethics. Talmud taught Jews how to live, how to be a mensch. Talmud was a central pillar of Jewish culture. In the past, No Jewish community could survive without the ability to study Talmud. Without Talmud, the same thing happened to all of them. Their Judaism weakened, the meaning of the laws became confused, and communities lost vitality and died out. Non-Jews recognized that too, and they banned it and burned it many times in the Middle Ages. Talmud study was prohibited because Gentiles knew a Jewish society that did not study Talmud had no real hope of survival. Next slide, please. Here we see Maimonides' statements on study. Learn as much as we possibly can, and then keep learning. Your purpose should always be to know the whole that was intended to be known. For our ancestors, there was no higher purpose than to study and learn about God. Slide off, please. Talmud is the source of Jewish law, but paradoxically, it could not be used as a law code. The Talmud only rarely comes to a final decision in its thousands of debates. So additional legal codes were necessary to translate the Talmud into a functioning legal system. So Talmud scholars in the medieval period wrote law codes based on Talmud. Unlike Talmudic commentary and analysis, these legal codes did provide the conclusions to legal questions discussed in Talmud. One of the greatest medieval codes is that of Moses Maimonides, whose acronym is Ramban, and who lived from 1135 to 1204, a century after Rashi. As Richard mentioned today, Maimonides' code is the Mishna Torah, or the Review of Torah. He discussed all topics of Jewish law and put them in their proper place in a logical sequence. He didn't record ancient discussions like in the Gemara, but wrote simple statements of the law in clear language. Maimonides wrote that the purpose of his code was to make the study of Talmud unnecessary if you only wanted to know the law. He was widely condemned for his arrogance and denounced as a threat to traditional Judaism. Still, the Mishnah Torah is one of the most impressive accomplishments in the long history of Jewish thought. The most influential law code taken from the Talmud in modern Jewish life, and which was also the last comprehensive law code, is the Shulchan Aruch. Here is a 5-minute video on this topic. Jenny?
In 1492, the mass expulsion of Jews in the Spanish Inquisition created waves of refugees throughout Europe and the Middle East. As Sephardic Jews from Spain intermingled with Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, people became confused about which traditions and rules to follow. 2 rabbis rose to settle the matter. Though these 2 men were from different traditions and never even met, their conflict and collaboration defined Judaism for half a millennium. The Jewish oral tradition represents the collected wisdom of rabbis over thousands of years, interpreting the Torah, arguing, and building consensus on what it means to be Jewish. These rules, called halacha, cover everything from prayers and festivals to dietary and marriage guidelines to procedures in court. They defined and shaped the entirety of Jewish life for millions of people. But by the start of the 16th century, the tradition was in trouble. Disputes between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, arguments between rabbis about the correct opinions, an explosion of new interpretations of the Torah, and a rise in spiritualist philosophies like Kabbalah meant that nobody could agree which opinions were right or which rules to follow. In 1522, Rabbi Yosef Karo decided to fix this. Born in Spain 4 years before the expulsion of the Jews, Karo eventually settled in Sfat, a holy city near the Sea of Galilee. A mystic and a scholar, Rabbi Karo spent 20 years compiling 32 different Jewish authorities into a catalog of Jewish law that he called the Beit Yosef. When there was disagreement, as there frequently was, he went with majority rule between the 3 most prominent scholars, the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. Although the Beit Yosef was a work of astonishing scholarship, it was also very, very long. So Rabbi Karo created a summary that listed the decisions from the Beit Yosef, defining once and for all what he called the fixed final law. It was like spark notes for 2,000 years of Jewish oral tradition. Rabbi Karo called it the Shulchan Aruch, Hebrew for a set table. While many Jewish scholars embraced the brilliance and utility of the Shulchan Aruch, a fierce backlash arose. prominent rabbis decried Karo for streamlining Jewish law and disregarding the disagreements that were a central feature of halacha. Others protested that Karo's choice to go with majority rule between two Sephardic rabbis and only one Ashkenazi rabbi strongly favored Sephardic interpretations, a serious problem for Ashkenazi Jews who were not willing to give up hundreds of years of unique customs. Luckily for Ashkenazi Jews, Rabbi Karo wasn't the only scholar working on a unified code of halacha. Rabbi Moses Isserlis was a brilliant scholar of Torah who founded a yeshiva in Krakow, Poland. He too recognized that the oral tradition had become overly confusing. While Rabbi Karo was writing the Beit Yosef, Rabbi Isserlis was compiling Ashkenazi halacha into a book titled the Darkei Moshe. He was nearly finished with his masterpiece when Karo's Shulchan Aruch arrived in Poland. The Shulchan Aruch created a dilemma for Rabbi Isserlis. Publishing the Darkei Moshe would reassert Ashkenazic tradition, but exacerbate the chaos of contradictory rulings. He faced a difficult choice: accept Rabbi Karo's conclusions and lose centuries of Ashkenazi traditions, or publish a competing book and risk a schism. Rabbi Isserlis instead came up with a third approach. Recognizing that Jewish unity was essential, Rabbi Isserlis abandoned the Darkei Moshe and instead used his knowledge to create a series of additions to Rabbi Karo's work. Since Karo had called his text the Set Table, Isserlis called his additions the Mapah, or tablecloth. For any laws in the Shulchan Aruch that were different for Ashkenazis, Isserlis added glosses that explained the variances. Thus, Rabbi Isserlis preserved the Ashkenazi tradition without creating disunity. Isserlis then printed the Shulchan Aruch with both Karo's original text and his additions, consolidating the two traditions into one book. By abandoning his own book and instead combining his knowledge with Rabbi Karo's, Rabbi Isserlis guaranteed the continuation of the Ashkenazi tradition while lending his wisdom to the combined text. This new Shulchan Aruch, complete with its tablecloth, quickly became the definitive text on Jewish law, a text that united Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. It was studied in yeshivas around the world, and later scholars added additional glosses and commentaries, placing their own dishes on the table that Rabbi Karo set. It remains a guiding light, a constitution of the Jewish people, nearly as important as the Torah or the Talmud. The story of the Shulchan Aruch represents the best of Jewish tradition. It marks a dedication to scholarship, combined with an appreciation of practicality, a unified text that still incorporates disagreement, and a recognition that, at the end of the day, working together makes us all stronger.
Up next, Martin Luther sparks one of
the largest revolutions in the history of Christianity.
Thank you. In Judaism, words have holy meaning. Even the letters in the words are holy. Following the destruction of the temple, Rome wrapped Rabbi Hanina in a Torah scroll and burned him alive. As he was dying, Rabbi Hanina cried out that he saw the letters of the words fly in the air up to heaven. Torah is not the parchment, but rather the words and the letters that are written on the parchment. Judaism's belief in the holiness of the written word spawned a unique form of Jewish art in the Middle Ages called micrography. Next slide, please. This is a page of Torah written in the Middle Ages. Look at the mythical creatures adorning the margins of the page. Next slide, please. Now, when we look closer, we see that these fantastical creatures with long tails are actually miniature Hebrew words written in such a word as to create the appearance of creatures on the page. This is micrography. It is Jewish miniature calligraphy, a unique form of Jewish art in the Middle Ages. Slide off, please. For 2,000 years, centers of Jewish learning and study spanned the Western Hemisphere. As Jews in one center were destroyed, expelled, or persecuted, the Jewish center of learning shifted to a more favorable location until the process was repeated and a new center of learning appeared elsewhere. Next slide, please. The first center of learning was in ancient Israel, number 1 on the map. Then, following Roman destruction of Judea, the center of learning shifted to Babylonia, number 2. Next, the center of learning shifted to North Africa and Spain, number 3. These North African and Spanish centers were guarded by the yeshivas in Babylonia. Their language was Arabic, and they were influenced by Arabic philosophy, science, and poetry. After Spain, the center of Jewish learning shifted to Middle Europe, number 4, France, Germany, Italy. Europe was then in the Dark Ages, and Jews there had little to learn from the surrounding culture. So European Jews had to create their own spiritual life. It is not surprising, as we saw in the last video, that 2 schools of Talmudic study emerged, Sephardic and Ashkenazi. As conditions worsened in Central Europe, the Jewish center shifted to Eastern Europe, number 5, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine. Next slide. After the destruction of European Jewry in the Holocaust, the center of Jewish learning shifted again, this time completing the circle and returning to the state of Israel, number 6, where it all began, and also to the United States. Slide off, please. The largest Jewish yeshiva in the world is now in Jerusalem, the Meir Yeshiva, with about 8,500 students. The largest yeshiva in the United States is in Lakewood, New Jersey, with about 6,700 students. The Talmud was the last book of primary source material in Jewish literature. All works that followed were largely based on Talmud and derived their authority from Talmud. Today, we've seen that study, particularly Talmud study, was central to the Jewish people throughout the ages. This last 2-minute video by Dr. Henry Abramson sums it all up. Dr. Abramson has scores of video on many Jewish topics, and he's a good speaker. He's also the author of this short book, The Sea of Talmud. Jenny?
Something supernatural going on here, because it's impossible to imagine the unlikely survival of this tiny minority, and not only surviving, but thriving under so many different environments. This is something that we really have to look at the grand scope, the huge arc of Jewish history before we can really experience it in its fullness. But let us look at one detail here. And this picture here is a beautiful ritual. It is a young Hasidic family here, a little boy here at the age of 3. Many of you may have done this yourself with your own children. Maybe you remember it yourself. I know I did it with my kids. But the ritual is that, and it's not a Hasidic ritual, it's a long-standing Jewish custom, that when a young child turns 3, which is considered a milestone in intellectual cognitive development, you begin to teach them the Aleph base, the Hebrew alphabet. And in order to instruct them that learning is sweet, you either coat the letters with honey, as is being done here, and then you have the child touch the letter, you tell him the name of the letter, and then of course he puts his finger in his mouth, so he associates the letter with that olfactory sensation of sweetness. A beautiful ritual that I remember with great fondness. And I think this is a key element of Jewish survival, that we have imbibed the sweetness of learning, and is really part of our core identity. The idea of turning to an intellectual problem as a source of chiyus, a source of life, something that vivifies us, something that is intrinsically sweet. That's something that contributes to Jewish survival and has allowed us to endure tremendous persecution and thrive despite it. So something supernatural going on here.
Thank you, Jimmy. I have seen that video clip many times, and every time I see it, it gives me a special feeling inside. So now I'm going to end here and turn the program over to Rabbi Magal.
What a perfect segue, where I offer that you should get something sweet. I have here a European cookie that my mother of blessed memory would have enjoyed. So everyone take a bite of something sweet that you have around you. All right, my name is Onot. And perhaps drink something. Since I'm teaching, it'll be something quite tame like tea, but whatever you have a thirst for. So that our learning should be sweet. I'm going to review something that I introduced last time, because it's a very good thing to have repetition, and it makes a groove. I have this theory of a groove. You hear it one time, it sort of washes over you. Second time, it sort of makes an impression. But after a while, if you repeat things in a different way, it makes a groove and it sticks and it's part of your memory. So I'm going to share something, and it should sound kind of familiar to you. My emphasis today, and it goes right with what Sheldon and Richard offered, is about interpretation and study. So what I showed you in the first class was that there were 6 sidarim, 6 orders. And one of the 6 orders is the seder, which means order, just like your seder at Passover. Kodashim, you hear the word kadosh? Kodashim are holy things. Kuf dalid shin is a root that means something holy. So one of the 6 orders of the Mishnah, and the Talmud is based on the Mishnah, is holy things. And I often use the word tractate. So there are 6 orders, but there are 63 tractates. In this order called holy things, here are the tractates, the internal learning sections. And I'd like to go through them just to show you how they're organized. So there is Zevachim, about animal and bird sacrifices. This is, of course, on Beit HaMikdash, which is when the temple stood. The second one is the one that I spoke about last week, and I will repeat this week. Menachot. Mincha is a flour or grain offering, or wine libations. These are the non-animal offerings, and I have it outlined because that's the tractate from which I will take a quote. Chulin are laws of non-sacred animal slaughter and dietary laws. Bechorot, about firstborn, both human and animal, and how we treat them and what special responsibilities they might have. Arachin, this is consecration of something that is worthy to bring to the temple. A tmura is exchange of sanctified things, and it's the whole way how you can change one thing into another that is appropriate to be offered. Kritot, spiritual excision of sin and sin offerings, how you get rid of any kind of sin and how you come back to a sense of purity. Me'ilah is about the treatment of temple property. What can you take in and out, and the limits. Tamid, you heard the Ner Tamid, the what we have as the eternal light. Well, Tamid just means eternal or constant. So daily, morning, and evening sacrifices. Midot has to do with the architecture. The midot are the measurements. And kinim have to do with nests or bird offerings. So all of these have to do with some kind of offerings, and you may very well ask me, but Rabbi, we don't have the temple, and when the Talmud, even the Mishnah, was written, the temple already had been destroyed. So what the genius of the rabbis was to take these libations, offerings, property, sacrifices, and say, how do we translate that into prayers and donations and contributions and laws and mitzvot in our lives today? So in this second tractate, the second section of the order of holy things, we read last week the story. Here's Menachot 29b. You can even see there's some little letters in here. We learned the story about Moses and Akiba. So I'm just going to repeat it, but to give you a little more insight of why on earth this story of Moses going into the yeshiva of Akiba hundreds of years after him, what does it all mean, and why is it in this tractate that's talking about grain sacrifices? I mean, where's the connection? So let's just review what the story is. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, when Moses ascended on high, that's when he was going to get the Torah, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters. You know, where we say jot and tittle, it's the yud and the taf, it's the way the letters are formed, and it's also sometimes the translation of those little crownlets, those little lines on top. So Moses asked God, Master of the universe, what is holding back your hand, Makev? What is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? Like, hurry up, we want the essence here. And God answers, there's a man who is destined to be born after several generations. He's named Akiva ben Yosef, and he will derive from each of these little crowns, each of these little additions, these decorations, so many halachot, so many rulings. It's for his sake that the crowns must be added to the letters of the Torah. So there's a reason why God is spending time on these decorations rather than rushing to give Moses the tablets to bring down. Moses responds. It's a wonderful conversation. Master of the universe. Ribono shel olam. Very often you'll have in the Hebrew or the Aramaic these contractions. Ribono shel olam, master of the universe. Show him to me. Can you imagine? They're up there on Sinai and Moses is not satisfied with the answer. Says, prove it, show me. So God says to him, Chazor, return behind you. Moses went out and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall. So this is very fanciful. And he didn't understand a thing of what they were saying, and he felt his strength leaving him. And he thought, oh my goodness, how could this be? I don't know enough Torah. I'm up here on 40 days and 40 nights learning, and I don't understand what is being studied here. So when Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of something, the students asked him, well, our teacher, where do you get this interpretation? It's all about interpretation here. And Rabbi Akiva said to them, here's the whole story. It is a halacha, it is a ruling transmitted to Moses from Sinai. Now Moses is sitting there. Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah that he was to receive. Well, I want to tell you more about this very dense story and what context it had. I'm going to stop the share. And I did some more research because my question was, why is this story in a passage all about menachot, all about these grain offerings? So the whole tractate begins with the Mishna way before this, the earlier writing, primarily with meal offerings in the ancient temple. So it was grain, oil, cakes, and in the Mishnah it said you have to give a perfect, unblemished kind of a cake, and if it's unleavened, this is how it has to be. Now the Gemara asked, well, wait a minute, if it's got more spice than the wheat, is it still an okay offering? And the Gemara goes into great detail about what would make these offerings not be acceptable. That is the link. So when it gets to this story, it's talking about what would make the Torah, because we don't have the offerings now, but what do we have that we pass down? The Torah. What would make it pasul if the form, like the recipe of the grain and the cakes, if the letters weren't formed correctly, would that make the Torah not holy and not usable? And at what point would it be not usable? Is it if a whole word was incorrectly copied? Or is it if it was faded? Or is it if it was missing one of these little crowns? And then comes the story. So it's scribal issues that are talked here, and it will go on also to talk about what about the form of the He and the Yud, which are letters in the holy name of God, right? The Yud, He, Vav, He. If those are not good, can the scribe scratch them out? And he can't. You cannot scratch out and correct the name of God in a Torah scroll. You have to start the whole cloth, it's called, the whole piece of parchment over again. Other words you could scratch out. So this is a whole other discussion that's going to come. But it all starts with the idea of what is an acceptable offering and how is it transmitted? And furthermore, how do we understand what was given in the Torah, commented on in the Mishnah, and now these rabbis are adding their own stories, their own understanding, their own interpretation. What happened with the exact copying and transmission of the written text of Torah? How could it be guarded? And this whole story about we're guarding the way that all the letters are formed in the Torah, and we are allowing it to be commented on in the future. The rabbis are actually facing two directions at once. They're looking back at the Torah from Sinai, Torah mi-Sinai, we call that, and also toward the future days of Messiah. And they stand in the middle in our world of duality and of challenges and of muddy gray areas where they have to make decisions. So Moses was standing between God and Rabbi Akiba in this story, and Akiba is standing between Torah and his students. And so we're going between a fundamentalist reading of Torah, where we think everything was revealed to Moses, and a kind of response and interpretation where everything is open to the rabbis. I read an interesting commentary that said the rabbis here are also exhibiting a kind of anxiety. Think of that. They're saying, they're proclaiming that they have the right to do this interpretation, that they're following certain rules, and moreover, that everything was already revealed and it is allowed to open up the interpretation even further. So I love this idea of the rabbis' anxiety in proclaiming their own right to do these interpretations. Now, I heard a lot of emphasis today on the importance of study. And I imagine that many of you listening today said, but I can't. So I'd like to share a story about, from another Seder, another order, about no excuse not to study. Let us look at that. All right, this is in Tractate Moed. Moed means sort of time, or a coming together in time. So these are all about holidays. We have Shabbat, Eruvin, which is an extension of Sabbath boundaries. If you've ever heard of an Eruv, they talk about it here, that boundary of where you can bring from the private to the public domain. It's a whole other discussion. All about Passover, all about the half shekel tax to be paid. And we're going to talk about something that comes within Yoma. This is one of the tractates within the Seder about holidays. Yoma has to do with the Day of Atonement. Yoma means Hayom, the day. Sukkot, something general about the festivals. Beitzah means egg, and it was, you know, how we sometimes have an egg on the Seder plate, and the idea of all different decrees regarding the festivals. Rosh Hashanah. When do you have fast days? There are all of these different days. Megillah, this is a fascinating one, which you could spend a lot of time on. How do you read the Megillah? Is it a holy book? In what ways is it a holy book? What do we learn? Anyway, Megillah is great. Moed Katan is the intermediate days. Katan means small. So you have the holidays, beginning and end, and you have the intermediate days, both in Sukkot and Passover. And then the three pilgrimage festivals of Passover and Sukkot and Shavuot. All right, here's our story. It's from Yoma 35b on studying Torah, whether you're rich, you're poor, or you're wicked. I love it. Apropos the great wealth of Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum, the Gemara cites that which the sages taught. They're always going back to the earlier Mishnah. A poor person and a wealthy person and a wicked person come to face judgment before the heavenly court for their conduct in this world. To the poor person, the members of court say, "Why did you not engage in Torah?" If he rationalizes his conduct and says, "I was poor and preoccupied with earning enough to pay for my sustenance. That is why I did not engage in Torah study." They have an answer. They say to him, "Were you any poorer than Hillel, who was wretchedly poor and nevertheless attempted to study Torah?" In case you don't know the story, they tell you. They said about Hillel the elder that each and every day he would work and earn half a dinar, half of which he would give to the guard of the study hall, and half of which he spent for his sustenance and the sustenance of the members of his family. One time he did not find employment to earn a wage, and the guard at the study hall did not allow him to enter. There was no free lunch here. You couldn't just come in and study. He ascended to the roof, suspended himself, can you imagine, and sat at the edge of the skylight just to hear the words of the Torah of the living God from the mouths of Shemaiah and Avtalion, the spiritual leaders of that generation. So there he is up at the roof listening. The sages continued and said, that day was Shabbat Eve, and it was the winter season of Tevet, and snow fell upon him from the sky. When it was dawn, Shemaiah said to Avtalion, Avtalion, my brother, every day at this hour the study hall is already bright, from the sunlight streaming through the skylight, and today it is dark. Is it perhaps a cloudy day? They looked up and focused their eyes, and they saw the image of a man in the skylight. They ascended and found him covered with snow 3 cubits high. They extricated him from the snow, they washed him and smeared oil on him, and they sat him opposite the bonfire to warm him. They said, this man is worthy for us to desecrate Shabbat for him. Remember, it was Shabbat already, but they did all of this because saving a life overrides Shabbat in any case. A lot more in the Talmud on that. However, this great man is especially deserving. Clearly, poverty is no excuse for the failure to attempt to study Torah. So much for that as an excuse. What about a wealthy man? If a wealthy man comes before the heavenly court, the members of the court say to him, why did you not engage in Torah? If he says, I was wealthy and preoccupied with managing my possessions, they say to him, were you any wealthier than Rabbi Elazar, who was exceedingly wealthy and nevertheless studied Torah? They said about Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum that his father left him an inheritance of 1,000 villages on land, and corresponding to them 1,000 ships at sea. And each and every day he takes a leather jug of flour on his shoulder and walks from city to city, from state to study Torah from the Torah scholars in each of those places. One time as he passed through the villages in his estate, and his servants found him, they didn't recognize him, and thinking he was a resident of the town, they pressed him into service for the master of the estate. He said to them, I beseech you, let me be, and I will go study Torah. And they said, not knowing who he was, we swear by the life of Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum that we will not let you be. The Gemara comments, and in all his days, he never went and saw all his possessions and property. Rather, he would sit and engage in the study of Torah all day and all night. What about the wicked one? If a wicked man comes to judgment, the members of the court say, why did you not engage in Torah? If he said, I was handsome and preoccupied with my evil inclination, my Yetzer Hara, as I had many temptations, they say to him, were you any more handsome than Yosef, who did not neglect Torah despite his beauty? He said about Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous. Each and every day, the wife of Potiphar, it's a great story, seduced him with words. Lie with me, she would say to him. In addition, the clothes that she wore to entice him in the morning, she did not wear to entice him in the evening. The clothes that she wore to entice him in the evening, she did not wear to entice him in the morning of the next day. So she was putting on a fashion show and enticing him. One day she said to him, submit to me and have relations with me. And he said to her, no. Although in the Torah, I have to say it goes, no, like he's hesitating, but he says no. She said to him, I will incarcerate you in the prison, which happens. He said to her, I do not fear you. As it is stated, God releases prisoners. She said to him, I will cause you to be bent over with suffering. And he said, God straightens those who are bent over. These are all in our morning blessings too. She said, I will blind your eyes. He said, God opens the eyes of the blind. She gave him 1,000 talents of silver to submit to her, to lie with her and to be with her, and he refused. The Gemara elaborates. Had he submitted to her, to lie with her in this world, it would have been decreed in heaven that he would be with her in the world to come. Therefore, he refused. Consequently, Hillel obligates the poor to study Torah, Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum obligates the wealthy, and Yosef obligates the wicked. For each category of people, there's a role model who overcame his preoccupations and temptations to study Torah. So here is our moment of thinking. Rega, choshvim. Just a minute, let's think. What is the underlying issue in all of these stories? What do the rabbi stories tell us about the unfolding interpretation of Torah? And what do they say about the importance of studying Torah, which of course includes the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch and the Mapah and the responsa up to our day, the vast body of sacred texts. So I open it up to all of you and I ask, why did we study these particular stories? What are the rabbis trying to teach us? What do you learn from the idea of the possibility of unfolding interpretation throughout the ages? Love to hear your responses. Yes, Linda Waddell.
Everyone's going to need to unmute themselves. Linda, I can get that one for you.
Yeah, I just did.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so there's really no excuse that we can come up with to neglect studying Torah. We can try, but whatever reason we come up with, there's always an answer as to, no, that doesn't work. Torah study is what is important, and it takes precedent.
Good afternoon, everybody, every week. Very good. Thank you for getting that. Yes, Anita.
So building on Linda, so studying is critically important. And as we study, we come up with more questions. And it's important for us to keep studying and keep turning it over and turning it over and turning it over. And throughout time and different cultures and different environments, we also have to look at what we are studying and what's come before in different and new ways. And that's what the crowns are for, that it opens us up to interpretation in terms of not 3,500 years ago, but today, based on what's happened over the past 3,500 years.
Thank you, Anita. Beautifully said. So there are issues of medical ethics that are addressed from what they knew back then. Let's say the possibility of abortion, or what to do with someone who is about to die. Do you count them in a minyan? Do you still give them food and drink? Where do you stand next to them? And all through history, it comes up to, how do we base our decisions today? Do we pull the plug? Do we, if someone is brain dead? And the thing is that we know so much more today about how the body works, and yet Jewish responses are based on all of these earlier texts, and we may get to them, we may not, but the idea is that it exists, that if you look up any topic, if you would go to Sefaria, remember Sefer means book, and Sefaria is like this huge library online, and you would type in any issue that you would have, there probably is a page on it that someone has done, or you could go to the original source. So I just thought that the fanciful stories that the rabbis give teach us a lesson in a way that is somehow acceptable. If they just gave the philosophy, one may interpret, would we really listen? But if we say, Moses went to Akiva's yeshiva and he said, oh my goodness, look what they did from the words I heard, that sticks. That makes an impression. So the stories, the Agadah, also lead into discussions that will lead to halacha, rulings. But as you heard in the wonderful little clip that Sheldon offered, there were later, bottom line, what are the rulings? Shulchan Aruch, here's the bottom line. And then whether it's Ashkenazi or Sephardi, they try to make it current, and they try to make it, because people can't study thousands and thousands of pages, they want to know the answer. So what do I do? And that is really what we're learning here. What do I do? Based on the deepest ethics and tenets of our religion as interpreted for our day. So we will continue with that kind of exploration in the next 2 sessions. Thank you so much.